They say that silence is heavy, that it presses down on you like a wool blanket soaked in winter rain. But that isn't quite right. If you live long enough, if you love deep enough, you learn that silence actually has a voice. It speaks in the creak of floorboards that no longer settle under two pairs of feet. It hums in the empty space on the other side of the mattress, and it whispers in the quiet comfort of a routine that refuses to change simply because the world has changed. You see, grief isn't a storm that passes. It is the new weather, and eventually you just learn how to dress for it. The clock on the bedside table didn't need to ring. It never did. Arthur was awake long before the red digital numbers clicked over to 6:30. He lay there for a long time, just breathing, listening to the house settle around him. It was an old house, a house that had seen 45 years of winters, 45 years of summer storms, and 45 years of laughter that seemed to have soaked into the very drywall, leaving a faint, vibrating echo that only he could hear. He stared up at the ceiling, watching the way the early morning light, pale and gray, filtered through the blinds. Dust motes danced in the sliver of light, swirling in slow motion, undisturbed, peaceful. There was no rush. There was never a rush anymore. He pulled the quilt back, the fabric soft and worn against his skin, and swung his legs over the side of the bed. His joints complained, a low, dull ache in his knees that greeted him every morning like an old friend he hadn't invited but tolerated anyway. He sat on the edge of the mattress for a moment, his hands resting on his knees, taking stock of the day before it had even begun. The floorboards were cool beneath his bare feet. He stood up slowly, unfolding his frame with a series of quiet cracks and pops, straightening his back against the pull of gravity. He walked to the window and peered out. The town was still asleep. A thick, low-hanging mist clung to the streetlights, turning the bulbs into hazy, glowing orbs of amber suspended in the gray. It had rained in the night. He could tell by the way the asphalt shone under the street lamps, a sleek black mirror reflecting the quiet world. It was a Tuesday, or maybe a Thursday. It didn't matter much. The days had a way of blending together, smoothing out at the edges like stones in a river, until they all felt the same, smooth, cool, and predictable. Arthur turned from the window and began his ritual. It was a dance he had perfected over 8 years of mornings just like this one. He didn't need to think about it. His body knew the rhythm. First, the bathroom. The splash of cold water on his face, shocking the sleep away, making the skin feel tight and alive. The smell of his shaving cream, sandalwood, and Old Spice, a scent that filled the small tiled room and hung in the humid air. He ran the razor over his jaw with a steady hand. He watched his own eyes in the mirror. They were tired eyes, rimmed with the years, but they were calm. There was a stillness in them that hadn't always been there. When he was younger, those eyes had been restless, always looking for the next job, the next paycheck, the next worry. Now, they just looked. They observed. He wiped his face with a towel, the rough terry cloth scrubbing his skin dry. Next, the closet. He chose a flannel shirt, a deep hunter green, soft from 100 washes. He buttoned it slowly, his fingers working the buttons through the holes with deliberate focus, top to bottom. He tucked it into his trousers, cinched his leather belt, the one with the brass buckle that was worn down to a dull shine, and sat on the cedar chest at the foot of the bed to put on his socks. Wool socks, always. Even in the summer, Arthur liked the cushion, the protection. He stepped into his boots, sturdy leather work boots that had long since retired from work but still carried the shape of his feet perfectly. He tied the laces, looping them tight, a double knot, just in case. He grabbed his wallet from the dresser, his keys, and his watch. It was a simple watch, a silver face with black numbers, a leather strap that was fraying slightly at the edges. He strapped it to his wrist, the familiar weight settling against his pulse. 7:58, right on time. He walked down the hallway, the photos on the wall watching him pass, black and white wedding photos, faded color photos of beach trips, school portraits of children who were now adults with children of their own. He didn't stop to look at them. He knew them by heart. He knew the exact curve of Martha's smile in the photo from '78. He knew the way the sun caught her hair in the picture from the Grand Canyon. He didn't need to see them to see them. He moved into the kitchen. It was clean, spotless. Arthur kept a tidy house, not because he was obsessive, but because disorder felt loud to him, and he preferred the quiet. He didn't turn on the coffee pot. There was no need. He walked to the back door, grabbed his heavy coat from the hook and a tweed flat cap that he had owned for longer than he can remember. He put the hat on, adjusting it slightly until it sat just right on his head. He slipped his arms into the coat, feeling the weight of the wool settle on his shoulders like a reassuring hand. He opened the back door and stepped out into the morning air. It was crisp, cold. It smelled of damp earth and dead leaves, the smell of autumn holding on tight before winter finally took over. Arthur took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill his lungs, holding it there for a moment, and then exhaling a long, slow cloud of white steam. He locked the door behind him. The click of the deadbolt was a sharp sound in the muffled morning. He checked it twice, just to be sure. And then he began to walk. He didn't drive to the diner. The car sat in the driveway, a pristine Buick that only saw the road on Sundays for church or the grocery store. The diner was only 6 blocks away. A nice walk, a necessary walk. It was good for the legs, good for the heart, and it gave him time to think, time to not think. He walked down the sidewalk, his boots making a steady, rhythmic crunching sound on the pavement. Crunch, step, crunch, step. The neighborhood was waking up. He saw a light flick on in the Johnsons' house. He saw the paper boy, a young kid on a bicycle, weaving down the street, tossing newspapers onto driveways with practiced apathy. The kid waved as he passed. Arthur raised a hand in return, a silent greeting. He kept walking. He passed the old oak tree on the corner of Elm, its branches bare and skeletal against the gray sky. He passed the bakery, where the smell of yeast and sugar was just starting to bleed out on the street, warm and inviting. But Arthur didn't stop. He had a destination. He had an appointment. He turned the corner onto Main Street, and there it was, the diner. It didn't look like much to most people, just a brick building with a large glass window in the front and a neon sign that buzzed with a low electric hum. The sign said diner in red letters, but the E flickered sometimes, vibrating between life and death. To Arthur, it was a sanctuary. It was a church with vinyl pews and the smell of bacon grease instead of incense. He walked to the door. He could see through the glass. It was warm inside. He could see the steam rising from the coffee pots behind the counter. He could see the waitresses moving back and forth in their pale blue uniforms. He reached for the handle. The brass was cold under his fingers. He pulled. A bell chimed above his head, a bright, cheerful ting-a-ling that announced his arrival. He stepped inside. The warmth hit him instantly. It wrapped around him, smelling of roasting coffee beans, maple syrup, and frying onions. It was the smell of comfort, the smell of home. The noise of the street faded away, replaced by the clinking of silverware on ceramic plates, the hiss of the grill, and the low murmur of conversations. Arthur wiped his boots on the mat, carefully removing any mud or grit from the outside world. He unbuttoned his coat. He folded it neatly, lining up the sleeves and placing it on the bench seat beside him. He took off his hat, setting it on top of the coat, and then he sat down. He slid into the booth, the vinyl groaning softly under his weight. He settled in. He placed his hands on the table, palms down, feeling the cool laminate surface. He looked across the table, at the empty seat opposite him. The light from the window hit the empty seat, illuminating the dust motes dancing there. For a moment, just a fleeting second, his heart gave a little squeeze, a familiar pang, the ghost of a memory. He could almost see her there, Martha, wearing her blue Sunday dress, or maybe her gardening clothes with the dirt on the knees. He could almost hear her laugh, that deep, throaty laugh that made everyone else in the room turn and smile. He could almost smell her perfume, lilacs and vanilla. But then the moment passed. The seat was empty. Just red vinyl and light. Arthur took a deep breath. He wasn't sad, not really. He was just present. He was keeping the appointment. He checked his watch. 7:58. Right on time. He clasped his hands together on the table, interlacing his fingers, his knuckles rough and weathered like old driftwood. He waited. He didn't look at a menu. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't even own a smartphone, just an old flip phone for emergencies that sat in his pocket, silent and dark. He just waited, watching the door, watching the people, watching the steam rise from a nearby table. And then she appeared. Nancy. She had been working here for 20 years. She had tired feet and a warm smile, and she knew Arthur better than she knew some of her own cousins. She walked over, holding a glass pot of coffee in one hand and 2 heavy, cream-colored ceramic mugs in the other. She didn't ask what he wanted. She didn't say, "Good morning, Arthur." She didn't need to. She simply smiled, a soft, knowing smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. She set the first mug down in front of Arthur. Clink. She poured. The dark liquid streamed out, hot and black, swirling into the cup, rising to the brim, releasing a cloud of fragrant steam that drifted up into Arthur's face. She stopped pouring just before it spilled over. Perfect. Then she reached across the table. She set the second mug down, right in front of the empty seat. Clink. She poured. The steam rose from the second cup, mingling with the steam from the first, 2 pillars of gray mist dancing together in the morning light. She set the pot down for a moment. Black, just how you both like it. Arthur looked up at her. His eyes were wet, just a little, but his voice was steady. "Thank you, Nancy," he rumbled. His voice was deep, like tires rolling over gravel. Nancy patted his shoulder, a quick, gentle touch, and then she walked away, leaving Arthur alone. Alone with his thoughts, alone with the morning, alone with 2 cups of coffee. Arthur wrapped his hands around his mug, letting the heat seep into his palms, warming his bones. He looked at the cup across from him. He watched the steam curl and twist, and then he began to speak, softly, barely a whisper, just loud enough for the empty seat to hear. "Morning, Martha," he said. "You'll never guess what the Johnson kid is up to now." He paused, giving the silence time to settle, giving her time to listen. He imagined her raising an eyebrow, the way she always did when he started gossiping about the neighbors. She used to say he was worse than the church ladies, but she always leaned in to listen anyway. "He bought a motorcycle," whispered Arthur, lifting his mug to his lips. "A loud one, bright yellow, sounds like a chainsaw trapped in a trash can." He took a sip. The coffee was perfect, strong, bitter, but with that rich, roasted finish that coated the tongue. I know," he chuckled softly, the sound vibrating in his chest. "You'd say, let the boy live, let him make his noise. But you aren't the one trying to nap on Sunday afternoons." He set his cup down. He looked at hers. The steam on her cup was slowing down now. At first it had been a vigorous column of white, rushing up to meet the ceiling fans. Now it was a lazy ribbon, curling and twisting, thinning out as the heat surrendered to the room. Arthur watched the physics of it. He watched the way the dark surface of the liquid remained perfectly still, a black obsidian pool. Minutes ticked by. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The diner grew busier around him. The construction crew from the highway project came in. 4 men in neon yellow vests, their heavy boots thudding against the linoleum. The phone at the front counter rang, a shrill, demanding sound that was quickly silenced by Nancy's efficient hand. But in booth number 4, time moved differently. It moved like honey, thick, slow, golden. Arthur talked about the leak in the garage roof. He talked about the stray cat that had started sleeping on the porch swing. He talked about how the price of apples had gone up again at the market. Just small things, the anchor points of a life. He spoke for 20 minutes, maybe 30. His own cup was empty now. just a brown ring at the bottom and a few wet grounds. But Martha's cup was still full, still black, and now it was cold. The steam was gone. The ceramic mug was no longer radiating heat. It sat there, a monument to the morning. Arthur sighed, a long, contented exhale. He felt lighter. He always did. He reached for his wallet, pulling a $10 bill from the fold. He placed it on the table, sliding it under the salt shaker so it wouldn't blow away if someone opened the door too fast. He was just about to reach for his coat when a shadow fell across the table. It wasn't Nancy. Nancy knew better to come over before Arthur stood up. Arthur looked up. It was a young woman, a girl really, maybe 19 or 20. She had her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail that bobbed when she moved. Her uniform was new, stiff, the blue fabric not yet softened by the wash. She held a plastic bus tub on her hip, and she was looking at the table with a furrowed brow. She didn't know the dance. She didn't know the rhythm. "Can I get that out of your way, sweetie?" she asked. Her voice was high, bright, fast. It cut through the slow, heavy atmosphere of the booth like a knife through water. She reached out, her hand moving toward Martha's cup. "It looks like you didn't touch this one," she said, her fingers just inches from the ceramic handle. "Stone cold. Want me to get you a fresh one to go?" Arthur didn't move fast. He didn't jump. He simply placed his hand on the table. "No," he said. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't angry. It was just solid, like a heavy door clicking shut. The girl froze. Her hand hovered in the air. She looked at Arthur, confused. She looked at the cold coffee, sitting there, wasted, useless. "Oh," she stammered. I saw it was full. I didn't want you to pay for it if it was, bad." Arthur looked at her. He really looked at her. He saw the uncertainty in her eyes. He saw the way she shifted the heavy tub on her hip. She was just doing her job. She was just trying to clear the table. Arthur softened. The lines around his eyes relaxed. He looked back at the cup. "It isn't bad," Arthur said, his voice dropping to that low, gravelly rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "My Martha," and the name tasted sweet in his mouth. "She sat in that seat every morning for 45 years. The girl blinked. She lowered her hand slowly. "We started every day right here," Arthur continued, his gaze drifting to the window, looking at the gray sky, looking at the past. He looked back at the girl. "She's been gone 8 years now," he said. "The doctors said it was her heart." He smiled, a small, sad, beautiful thing. "But the doctors don't know everything. Her heart is right here." He nodded toward the cold coffee. "I talk," Arthur whispered, "and she listens, and as long as that cup is sitting there, she isn't really gone, is she?" The girl stood very still. The noise of the diner seemed to drop away. The clatter of the dishes, the sizzle of the grill, the laughing construction workers, it all faded into a dull hum in the background. She looked at the cup, really looked at it. She saw it not as a waste of coffee or a dirty dish to be washed. She saw it for what it was, a placeholder, a memory, a love letter written in dark roast and ceramic. Her eyes softened. She hugged the bus tub a little tighter against her side. "No," she whispered, her voice gentle now, respectful. "No, I guess she isn't." She took a step back. I'll just leave that be, then," she said. Arthur nodded. "Thank you," he said. The girl walked away, moving a little slower than she had before, her ponytail swaying gently. Arthur sat for one more moment. He looked across the table one last time. "She seems nice," he murmured to the empty seat. "A little rush in her step, but she's young. She'll learn to slow down." He placed his hands on the table and pushed himself up. The vinyl booth groaned as his weight lifted. He stood, tall and steady. He put on his coat, buttoning it slowly, deliberately, top to bottom. He put on his hat, adjusting the brim. He didn't look back at the table. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what he was leaving behind. He walked toward the door, the bell above his head ringing out its cheerful goodbye. Ting-a-ling! He stepped out into the cold morning air, back to the sidewalk, back to the world that kept moving. Inside the diner, on the table of booth number 4, the $10 bill sat under the salt shaker, and opposite the empty seat, the cold cup of black coffee sat, cold and still, waiting for tomorrow. The walk back from the diner was always slower. There was no appointment to keep now. No clock ticking down the seconds until the coffee poured. There was only the day, stretching out before him like a long, unpaved road. The sun had started to burn through the morning mist. It wasn't a harsh sun. It was a gentle autumn sun, the kind that warms the back of your neck but leaves the air cool enough to see your breath. Arthur walked with his hands deep in his coat pockets. He could feel the worn lining of the wool, soft and fraying against his knuckles. He listened to the town waking up around him. A distant dog barked, a rhythmic, hollow sound echoing off the brick buildings. A car drove by, tires singing on the damp asphalt, fading away into the silence. But mostly, it was quiet. Arthur turned the corner onto his street. His house sat there, waiting for him. It was a sturdy house, built in the 50s, brick and wood, settled deep into the earth, rooted like the old oak tree in the front yard. He walked up the driveway. He didn't go to the front door. He never did during the day. Instead, he walked around the side, past the garage where his Buick slept under a canvas tarp, and toward the backyard, to the garden gate. It was a wooden gate, made of cedar planks that had turned a silvery gray with age. Arthur reached for the latch. It was iron, heavy and rusted just enough to give it character. He lifted it. Click. The sound was sharp, precise. He pushed the gate open. It swung inward with a low, complaining creak, a sound that Arthur had meant to fix with a can of oil for 3 years now, but never got around to. Maybe he liked the sound. It was the sound of entering his sanctuary. He stepped through and closed it behind him. The latch fell back into place. Clack. Silence again. The backyard was enclosed by a tall hedge of privet, thick and green, creating a wall that kept the rest of the world at bay. And inside was the garden, Martha's garden. When they had first bought the house, this had just been grass, a flat, boring square of green. But Martha, she had vision. She saw colors where there were none. She saw life where there was only dirt. Over 40 years she had turned the soil, planted the seeds, and coaxed a masterpiece out of the ground. Now it was Arthur's job to keep it. He wasn't a gardener by nature. He was a man of mechanics, of gears and levers, of things that could be fixed with a wrench. Plants were different. They were moody. They were quiet. But he had learned. He walked to the potting shed in the corner of the yard. It was a small structure, barely 6 feet by 8 feet, with a sloped roof covered in moss. He opened the door. The smell hit him. It was the best smell in the world. Damp earth, dried peat moss, old terracotta pots, and the sharp, metallic tang of rusty tools. It smelled like work. It smelled like patience. Arthur stepped inside, the floorboards bending slightly under his boots. He took his coat off, hanging it on a nail by the door. He took his hat off, placing it on the workbench. He rolled up the sleeves of his flannel shirt. 1 fold, 2 folds, 3, exposing his forearms, weathered and tanned, covered in the faded scars of a life spent working with his hands. He reached for his gloves. They were leather, stiff and stained with the soil of 1,000 afternoons. He pulled them on. They fit tight, secure. He reached for the shears. They hung on the pegboard, outlined in black marker where Martha had traced him decades ago, so he would always know where they belonged. He took them down. They were heavy in his hand, solid steel. He tested the spring. Snip, snip. The blades slid past each other with a satisfying resistance. Ready. Arthur walked back out into the sunlight. He moved to the rose bushes along the back fence. They were dormant now, mostly sleeping for the winter, but there were still dead heads to be cleared, stray branches to be tamed. He approached the first bush. It was an old one, a peace rose, with thick, thorny canes that looked like dragon scales. Arthur knelt down. His knees popped, a dry crack, but the pain was distant. He settled into the dirt. He didn't use a kneeling pad. He liked the feel of the ground. It felt honest. He reached out and took hold of a dead branch. It was brown and brittle. He positioned the shears. He didn't rush. He looked at the angle of the cut. Martha had taught him, cut just above the node at a 45-degree angle so the water runs off. He adjusted his grip. He squeezed. Snick.
The branch fell away. It landed silently in the mulch. Arthur picked it up and placed it in the trug bucket beside him. He moved to the next branch, and the next.
There was a rhythm to it. Assess, position, cut. Assess, position, cut. It was hypnotic. His mind cleared. The worries about the roof, the thoughts about the coffee, the memories of the past, they all faded into the background. There was only the rose bush. There was only the task. The sun moved higher in the sky. The shadows shifted, stretching long and thin across the grass. A robin landed on the fence post nearby. It watched him with a black, beady eye. Arthur stopped. He rested his hands on his thighs. He looked at the bird. "Morning," he whispered. The bird tilted its head. It chirped once, a bright note in the stillness, and then flew away. Arthur smiled. He went back to work. He worked his way down the line of bushes, one by one, cleaning them up, preparing them for the cold that was coming. It was slow work, tedious work to some, but to Arthur it was a conversation. It was his way of telling Martha that he was still here, that he was still taking care of things, that the roses would bloom again in the spring, just like she always said they would. He reached the end of the row. His back was stiff, his hands were tired, but his spirit was quiet. He stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from his knees. He looked at the row of bushes. They looked neat, tidy, ready to rest. He picked up the trug bucket, filled with the dead wood of the season. He walked to the compost heap in the far corner. He tipped the bucket over. The branches tumbled out, joining the leaves and the grass clippings, returning to the earth to become soil again. The circle of life, simple, unbroken. Arthur walked back to the shed. He hung the shears back on the pegboard, right inside the black outline. He took off his gloves, laying them on the bench. He rolled down his sleeves. He put on his coat. He put on his hat. He stepped out of the shed and closed the door. He stood in the center of the garden for a moment. The sun was fully up now. The day was awake, but here, behind the hedges, it was still peaceful. He took a deep breath. The air smelled sweeter now, smelled of cut wood and turned earth. Arthur nodded to the garden, a silent job well done. He turned and walked back to the house. His stomach gave a low rumble. Lunchtime, or close enough. He opened the back door to the kitchen. The warmth of the house greeted him. It was a different kind of warmth than the diner. It was quiet, still. He wiped his boots on the mat, carefully, deliberately. He stepped inside. The clock on the wall ticked. Tick, tock. 11:30. The morning was gone, spent in the best way possible, slowly. Arthur unbuttoned his coat and hung it on the hook. He was ready for the afternoon, whatever it might bring, or more likely, whatever it might simply let be. Chapter 3. The Afternoon Dust. The kitchen was quiet now. the kind of quiet that you can only find in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. It was a thick silence, layered with the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Arthur stood at the counter. He made himself lunch. It was a simple affair. He wasn't a chef, and he didn't pretend to be. 2 slices of wheat bread, a thick slice of cheddar, sharp and crumbly, a slice of ham, and a thin layer of mustard spread with the back of a spoon, careful to reach all the way to the crusts. He cut the sandwich in half, diagonally, always diagonally. Martha used to say it tasted better that way, and after 45 years, Arthur was inclined to agree. He placed it on a small plate, white china with a faint blue pattern around the rim. He poured a glass of water from the tap, letting it run cold first, and then he walked to the table. He didn't eat fast. He took small bites, chewing slowly, looking out the window at the bird feeder he had filled the day before. A cardinal landed, bright red against the brown branches, a flash of life in the stillness. Arthur stopped. He rested his hands on his thighs. He looked at the bird. "Morning," he whispered. The bird tilted its head. It chirped once, a bright note in the stillness, and then flew away. Arthur smiled. He went back to work. He worked his way down the line of bushes, one by one, cleaning them up, preparing them for the cold that was coming. It was slow work, tedious work to some, but to Arthur it was a conversation. It was his way of telling Martha that he was still here, that he was still taking care of things, that the roses would bloom again in the spring, just like she always said they would. He reached the end of the row. His back was stiff, his hands were tired, but his spirit was quiet. He stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from his knees. He looked at the row of bushes. They looked neat, tidy, ready to rest. He picked up the trug bucket, filled with the dead wood of the season. He walked to the compost heap in the far corner. He tipped the bucket over. The branches tumbled out, joining the leaves and the grass clippings, returning to the earth to become soil again. The circle of life, simple, unbroken. Arthur walked back to the shed. He hung the shears back on the pegboard, right inside the black outline. He took off his gloves, laying them on the bench. He rolled down his sleeves. He put on his coat. He put on his hat. He stepped out of the shed and closed the door. He stood in the center of the garden for a moment. The sun was fully up now. The day was awake. But here, behind the hedges, it was still peaceful. He took a deep breath. The air smelled sweeter now, smelled of cut wood and turned earth. Arthur nodded to the garden, a silent job well done. He turned and walked back to the house. His stomach gave a low rumble. Lunchtime, or close enough. He opened the back door to the kitchen. The warmth of the house greeted him. It was a different kind of warmth than the diner. It was quiet, still. He wiped his boots on the mat, carefully, deliberately. He stepped inside. The clock on the wall ticked. Tick, tock. 11:30. The morning was gone, spent in the best way possible, slowly. Arthur unbuttoned his coat and hung it on the hook. He was ready for the afternoon, whatever it might bring, or more likely, whatever it might simply let be. Chapter 3. The Afternoon Dust. The kitchen was quiet now, the kind of quiet that you can only find in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. It was a thick silence, layered with the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Arthur stood at the counter. He made himself lunch. It was a simple affair. He wasn't a chef, and he didn't pretend to be. 2 slices of wheat bread, a thick slice of cheddar, sharp and crumbly, a slice of ham, and a thin layer of mustard spread with the back of a spoon, careful to reach all the way to the crusts. He cut the sandwich in half, diagonally, always diagonally. Martha used to say it tasted better that way, and after 45 years, Arthur was inclined to agree. He placed it on a small plate, white china with a faint blue pattern around the rim. He poured a glass of water from the tap, letting it run cold first, and then he walked to the table. He didn't eat fast. He took small bites, chewing slowly, looking out the window at the bird feeder he had filled the day before. A cardinal landed, bright red against the brown branches, a flash of life in the stillness. Arthur watched it peck at the seeds, its head bobbing up and down. He finished his sandwich. He drank his water. He stood up and carried his plate to the sink. He washed it immediately. Hot water, soap, a scrub with the sponge, rinse, and into the drying rack. There were no dishes left in the sink. There never were. Arthur dried his hands on the towel hanging from the oven handle. Now came the best part of the day, the afternoon lull, the time when the world seemed to stop spinning for just an hour or two. He walked into the living room. The light was different here. The afternoon sun was streaming through the sheer curtains, turning the air into a hazy golden mist. Dust motes floated in the beams, suspended in time, drifting like tiny stars in a miniature galaxy. Arthur walked to his chair. It was a leather recliner, burgundy. It was old, the leather worn smooth at the arms and cracked along the headrest like a dry riverbed. It was shaped perfectly to his body. It knew his back. It knew his shoulders. It knew exactly how he liked to sit. But he didn't sit down yet. Not quite yet. He walked past the chair to the cabinet against the far wall. It was a beautiful piece of furniture, walnut, dark and rich. It was a stereo console, from back when stereos were furniture, not just gadgets. Arthur lifted the heavy wooden lid. It opened with a smooth hydraulic sigh. Inside, the turntable sat waiting, chrome and black rubber. Arthur ran his finger along the edge of the cabinet. No dust. He kept it clean. He reached down to the shelf below, where the records were stored. Rows of cardboard sleeves, smelling of old paper and vinyl. He flipped through them. Flip, flip, flip. The sound of the cardboard rubbing against cardboard was soft, tactile. He stopped at one. Ben Webster, Soulville. Arthur pulled the record out. He slid the vinyl disc from its paper sleeve. He held it by the edges, careful not to touch the grooves. He placed it on the turntable. He flipped the switch. The platter began to spin, round and round, a black circle blurring into motion. Arthur lifted the tone arm. It was light, delicate. He moved it over the spinning record. He lowered it, gently, so gently. There was a moment of silence, and then pop, hiss, crackle. The sound of the needle finding the groove. It was a warm sound, a sound that digital music just couldn't replicate. It sounded like a fire crackling in a hearth. And then the saxophone started, low, breathy, smooth as molasses. It filled the room. It didn't demand attention. It just coated the air in a layer of comfort. Arthur closed the lid of the console. He walked back to his chair. He sat down. The leather groaned, welcoming him back. He reached for the lever on the side and pulled. The footrest rose up. His legs stretched out. He settled back, letting his head rest against the worn leather. He closed his eyes. He listened to the music. He didn't think about the past. He didn't think about the future. He just drifted. He could feel the weight of his own body sinking into the chair. His arms felt heavy. His legs felt heavy. His breathing slowed down. In and out. In and out. The saxophone wove a melody around him, wrapping him in a blanket of comfort. He remembered dancing in this room years ago, before the carpet was replaced, before his knees started to ache. Martha would turn the volume up just a little too loud for the neighbors and pull him out of this very chair. She would put her head on his chest. They would sway, just sway, moving in small circles on the floorboards. He could remember the feeling of her hand in his, small, warm, strong. He could remember the smell of her shampoo, but the memory wasn't sharp anymore. It was soft, fuzzy around the edges, like an old photograph that had been left in the sun. It didn't hurt. It was just there, part of him, like his heartbeat. Arthur's chin dipped toward his chest. The music played on. The dust motes continued their slow dance in the sunbeams. The house was safe. The garden was tended. The coffee had been drunk. And Arthur finally let go. He drifted, deeper and deeper, into the quiet gray velvet of an afternoon nap. Everything was still. Everything was right. The record spun, the world turned, and Arthur slept.